Hi, this is Harriet Grayson. I am your host and producer of Community Culture Showcase, and my job is to show you all those wonderful hidden gems of music and art and theater that happens to be around our beautiful coastal communities. And today I am very fortunate to have what he calls himself as a roots musician, and I guess maybe even composer, Craig Edwards. And Craig has brought with us a whole bunch of instruments, some really kind of interesting looking ones, a little fiddle, he's got a guitar, well you might expect that from any musician, but he's also got some, what do you call this?
That's a button accordion.
A button accordion. I should know something about it because once upon a time my mother thought I had musical talent, which I had none, and I actually played the accordion for a couple of years.
Yeah.
So Craig, tell us about what this roots music is and a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in it.
Sure. Roots music is a term that has in some ways replaced the way that the term folk music was used back before the folk music revival. Mm-hmm. So once the folk music revival started and people started composing music in that idiom, they still called it folk music. Roots music is used to talk about the music that people play in their communities, music that's been around for a long time, music that you might not necessarily even know who composed it, although that's not always true.
Okay.
And traditions that are handed down mostly just by people hearing it and learning to play it by watching other people play.
Right. These are people who are not schooled in music. They don't graduate from the Berklee School of Music.
Right.
They don't know how to read it. They just hear it and it catches on and people kind of like it.
That's right.
So I think of roots music as something maybe out of Appalachia, you know, out of the mountain stuff. And we were talking earlier about Louisiana, and
That's
out
right.
of that kind of culture, you hear people playing over and over again. My understanding, as limited as it is that actually some of the fiddle stuff and even the bagpipe stuff is stuff that was originally played in the Celtic Islands and in Ireland, and then they kind of changed it because it didn't have a lot to work from when they came to places like Tennessee and Kentucky and,
Right.
and places like that.
Well, let's start with the fiddle. This is an instrument that really is only developed in this form. There were earlier versions of this called viols, but this form of bowed-stringed instrument really dates back to the 1600s, early 1700s. Before that, the Baroque viols and other kinds of fiddle or violin ancestors, and this is, I call it a fiddle, but this is a violin, just like someone would use in a classical music setting. And it's louder and stronger and a slightly lower range than a lot of the earlier viols. So it was a new instrument in those older traditional music cultures. Your mention of the bagpipes is apropos in that in Scotland, for instance, this became very popular shortly after it was invented by people like, or modified into this form by people like Stradivarius and Amati and Guarneri, those great violin maker names. And once it got into the hands of people whose communities played bagpipe music, they started transferring the music that they had played on bagpipes or in Ireland on harps and flutes onto this instrument and developed ways to play it that are reminiscent of those earlier styles. But that's right at the same time that people started, from those islands, from the British Isles, started colonizing what's now the United States. So at that time, there wasn't a long-established fiddling tradition in the British Isles. People came over from those cultural communities with that same music in their heads, but then once they were away from their homogeneous background, they developed their own take on it, which is why music in Appalachia sounds different than music in Scotland. And for that matter, why music in Mississippi sounds different from music in Connecticut. Because people in different areas were influenced by other groups of people that they encountered. In the South, there's a strong African American influence on the fiddle styles,
Okay.
as well as the Scottish and Irish background.
Right.
Whereas in New England, more French Canadian, the earlier kind of English styles, which are different than the Celtic styles, the Scottish and Irish. So you get these regional styles in the United States that derive from those different communities, hearing each other play music, taking each other's instruments and saying, oh, if I was going to play this, I'd make it sound this way. Mm-hmm. There's a great, actually one of my favorite historical pieces in John James Audubon's autobiography. He's at a place called Chillicothe. It's right where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers come together. And this is back in the 1830s. And he describes a music session where there's a Scotsman playing a fiddle, an African American playing a banjo, and an Indian playing something he describes as a nose flute. But it's a good
Sure.
early description of the kind of encounter that formed American music and made it sound different than music back in Ireland, where pretty much everybody around you was still Irish.
Right, right. Interesting. So you are going to play for us a little bit?
I'll do that. Let's see. I'll give you a tune that I learned from a fiddler in West Virginia. Actually, I'm going to tune this up a little bit.
So this is the exact same instrument that a kid learning how to play orchestral music actually plays, although the style, obviously, of what they play is going to be considerably different. I suppose in today's modern world, there have become people who no longer just pure oral tradition, where they do write them down and say
Absolutely.
them, and we have some historical record of it.
And even back in the 18th and 19th century, by no means were all people who played traditional music musically illiterate. People wrote down tunes, people learned how to read and write music, but generally the music wasn't composed kind of on the page. It was
Kind of improvised and then written down.
yeah, someone would make the tune and remember it and eventually write it down. Someone would hear it and want to remember somebody else's music.
Right, right.
So this is a piece that gives you a good sense of that kind of early style I was talking about. It sounds a little like a bagpipe tune, but it's got a certain lonesome wildness to it that evokes the hills and hollows of West Virginia, which is where it was first played back in probably the 1790s by the Carpenter family, and that's a family name that resounds in the history of West Virginia fiddling. There were a lot of great carpenters who were fiddlers. This one is called the Upiney Mountains.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now, how does this sound compare to some of the modern fiddles that we hear, like people like Alison Krauss?
Oh, it's the same
It's the same kind of thing.
kind of thing.
So she would be playing the same kind of
instrument.
instrument, same kind of music. It's people like that who I guess have popularized, so that I can tell you her name and have actually heard her play in person. That I even so it's exactly the same kind of tradition. So one of my favorite old style country singers, not like the Nashville sound, is Iris DeMint.
Sure.
And so in her, I don't know whether she plays herself, but in a lot of her very country, cold country kind of singing, she has those fiddles behind her, providing some background. So that's interesting. So how'd you pick this up?
Well, my father calls square dances, and tried to play the fiddle for a while. It never really took, but he had one in the closet in his study. And when I was about 9, I started taking it out when he wasn't around, because we weren't supposed to touch it.
Oh, okay.
And I would when no one was around, I'd scratch away on it and try to get sounds out of it, and eventually I could play it a little bit. And one day he heard me, and he could tell what I was trying to play, so he said, "Well, you take it."
Oh, okay. Did you take lessons?
Not really.
Okay.
I went to one when I was first. I took the fiddle. I didn't get really serious about this instrument until I was about 20, and I went to a place in West Virginia called the Augusta Heritage Arts Workshops, which are held at Davis and Elkins College in the summer times, and that's in Elkins, West Virginia. And it's an extraordinary institution. They bring old timers, people who learned in the tradition, as well as extremely talented and deeply knowledgeable people who have learned those styles from other backgrounds. But there's always a core of old timers, and you come and take classes, and you learn from these people. It's how I met some of my mentors. Ernie Carpenter, from whom I learned that first tune, was somebody I met when I was at Augusta.
Now, you were telling me before that you actually are a North Carolina native.
Right.
And a longtime Virginia resident.
Yes.
So so you heard some of those sounds when you were in the South?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Sure.
And is there someone that you heard when you were a kid and interested in this, or even when you were 20, that you said, "Oh, that's exactly who I want to be like"?
There were people, but I was too shy to go up and find out who they were. It was only later on I started going and mustered up the courage to go and visit, old guys.
Oh, okay. And when you went to this West Virginia Institute, there were a whole bunch of people like yourself. I mean, people who were interested in actually playing better. I guess is that the actual reason for going?
Yeah, or just I took a beginner class there that lasted a week, and then I took the intermediate class right afterwards. I had already been playing other stringed instruments for quite some time at that point, so I picked it up pretty quickly. And in those circumstances, when they say beginner and intermediate, the intermediate isn't usually that far advanced from a beginner. When they say beginner, they mean someone who's literally never picked the instrument up before.
Oh, okay.
And then intermediate is somebody who can kind of scratch something out and wants to get better. And then the advanced classes, you'll find a range of levels, and sometimes they kind of have advanced classes or it's just you get paired up with a teacher who's teaching at a level that you're ready to learn.
So my daughter for many years played the cello, and of course now there are electric cellos. I mean, cello has been electrified and used in lots of other things besides orchestral music. But I mean, so she learned in a very traditional way about how to play a string instrument. So when you're learning, or when other people want to get involved, you just have to have a great ear. Is that it? You listen and you hear it, and then you pick it up and play it yourself.
And you go and you find people who can play, and you watch them and you listen to them, and then you go off and you try and figure out how they were doing what they did. And of course, this is, it's a different world now with all the digital technology
Right.
and video that's available. When I was learning back in the 70s and the 80s, you had to get hold of vinyl records and move the tone arm back to get a phrase,
Right.
or you might have cassette tapes. And when I visited people like Ernie Carpenter or Melvin Wine in West Virginia, or went to Nova Scotia and learned from Cape Breton style fiddlers up there, or to Louisiana to learn this instrument. I'd bring along a cassette recorder and record them, and then you hit the rewind button
Right.
and back and forth. Now there's just a huge wealth of all kinds of archival film and recording from any number of sources. You can find almost anything on YouTube
Right.
alone, but there's the Digital Library of Appalachia is a source that you can go online and find hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of performances of all kinds of traditional music. Or slipperyhill.com is another place where you can go and find just, an encyclopedia of American fiddle music.
I know at one point the Smithsonian Institution was actually doing a whole bunch of recordings or saving recordings that they picked up and put together into all kinds of compilations. I myself have one from the old folk stuff of Woody Guthrie,
Sure.
Pete Seeger from years ago. I mean, some of this old stuff, and names that are completely unknown to me,
Right.
but whose songs I have heard because there are different variations of those songs. So when you pick up a piece like this, do you, once you've become quite good at it, do you then make variations on it that then are your style?
It depends on the style of music that the piece comes from. With a lot of the Southern traditional music or the traditional music in New England or Ireland, what you're trying to do is get to the heart of the tradition. And if you want to do something new, you compose a tune and hope that other people learn it and it enters the oral tradition.
Okay.
That being said, you can spend hours, days, weeks, months, years trying to learn a tune from a great player who has inspired you to want to learn this music,
Right.
and try to play it as close as you can to the way that player plays it. And after all that time, when you're done, you're still going to sound like yourself.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
It's just that you imbibe the nuances of tradition from that other player, but no two players sound exactly alike.
Okay.
So it's not really a question of trying to make it your own or even trying to add variations that are different. That's not the goal in
Okay.
these styles.
All right.
Now I play other styles where a lot of African American styles. The whole tradition is variation within the performance.
Right. More improvisation.
You have a form, and then each performance has its own distinctive character. A jazz musician doesn't play their solo the same way twice ever.
Right. Right.
But they're certainly taking their ideas from the same area when they they'll come up with a way that they want to approach the piece. But that's they're
Sure.
just two different ways of approaching
Sure.
music. And when I go to fiddlers conventions, people will take one of these tunes, and you'll have a couple of fiddles and a banjo and a guitar, maybe a bass, and you're at some place where the festival's happening way up in the mountains, and it's you're starting out at about 11 o'clock, and it's dark, and there's a couple little lanterns going, and somebody starts a tune, and everybody else comes in with them, and you lean into it, and you just try to make it good. You try to get to that spot where everybody's doing the role that makes it sound just right, and when you hit it, it just all pulls together, and then you might just keep playing that tune, not trying to improvise or
Right.
make it all different, because it's not what it's about. But you might play that tune for 10, 12 minutes. And it's a meditation, it takes you up to a level where you know what's coming, but of course every time you do it, without trying to introduce variation, there is that little nuance that just, when you hear it and you're focusing on it, just fills you with delight.
And are there many or a few famous kind of festivals that happen every year, like the Newport Folk Festival or something like that?
The Newport Folk Festival is mostly doing singer-songwriter music these days, based in roots traditions, and there's great stuff there. It's tremendous. But for the styles of music that I'm talking about, the Appalachian String Band Music Festival, it's held every year in Clifftop, West Virginia, on the first weekend of August. The Festival of American Fiddle Tunes out in Port Townsend, Washington. The oldest continuous festival for this Southern old-time music style is held in Galax, Virginia, every year, and it must be getting on 85 years. They've had it every year, and it's got old time and bluegrass, which are bluegrass is a younger music than the style that I'm playing. It derives from it, but bluegrass people will take solos, right? And it'll have arrangements, and there's tight harmony vocals with that everybody. It's all worked out.
Right.
And then within that framework, people take virtuosic solos. So that's a different approach, using a lot of the same materials.
Right, right. Are there singers that go along with these fiddlers?
Sure.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Let's see, I'll give you here's a tune. I haven't played anything lively yet, but I'll do this one. This is one called Cotton Eye Joe.
Okay.
Come from? Where did you go? Where'd you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? Cornstalk fiddle and a shoestring bow played a little tune named Cotton Eye Joe. Where'd you come from? Where did you go? Where'd you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? I fell down, I stubbed my toe, called for the doctor, Cotton Eye Joe. Where'd you come from? Where did you go? Where'd you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? Whistle for the wind and the wind did blow, blew me all the way to the Cotton Eye Joe. Where'd you come from? Where did you go? Where'd you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? Hung up the fiddle and he hung up the bow. Joe's gone, where we all gonna go? Where'd you come from? Where did you go? Where'd you come from, Cotton Eye Joe?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Now you could dance to that one.
Yes, you can.
I bet you that's what it's for, dancing music. That's wonderful. So here you are in Connecticut. So how did you get from all this way to Connecticut? And tell us a little bit about the stuff that you do with the fiddle here in this state.
Well, I went to Wesleyan University, so I came up here in 1978, and my brother was going there, my older brother, and he thought it would be a good place for me, so he took me to see the musical instrument collection there, it's a world instrument collection. It's got instruments from all over the world. And I took one look at it and said, this is where I want to go. And it's got a great ethnomusicology program, which is the study of music in its cultural setting. So I majored in music and concentrated in ethnomusicology, and started a couple of bands while I was there, a bluegrass band, and then a band that focused mainly on old-time music, but also played Irish music and Cape Breton music and French Canadian music. And we, while we were still at school, there was a place across the river in Portland, Connecticut, called the Taylor Estate or the St. Clements Estate, that belonged to the university at the time. Now they just have weddings there. But it was a big rambling estate that was built back in the teens or 20s by a very wealthy family. And if you had a student group, as we had the Friends of Old Time Music, which is kind of a catch-all group name for a lot of, that exists in a lot of places. And so if you had a student group, you could just sign this place out for an event.
Oh.
So we'd sign it out for a weekend a couple times a year and have what we call the spring stomp and the fall stomp. And we spread the word, and musicians came from all over New England.
Wow.
And you'd walk into one room and there'd be, really great French Canadian music. In another room there'd be an Irish session. Another room people would be playing Cajun music and then old time music and people playing blues and it was just a great event that we put on for 3 or 4 years in a row, a couple times a year.
Right.
And the band that I was in when I graduated from school, a couple of them were still in school, so I stayed around because we were getting hired to play libraries and town greens, things like that, and dances, and occasional, do concerts at coffee houses or even folk festivals. I was substitute teaching to kind of make the whole thing work. And that got pretty old. And I'd been doing it for about 1.5 years when I saw an advertisement in the music studios at Wesleyan for a job as a staff musician at Mystic Seaport.
Oh, okay.
Said, do you play one of the following instruments? Are you interested in history and culture? Are you physically fit? Can you climb on ships? And I looked at it and thought, that's me. I took it off the wall so no one else would see it. And I called him up and I was working there 2 weeks later.
Oh, wonderful. And that's
So-
what you still do today?
And I've been associated with the museum ever since. It's been 30 years, actually, just about exactly 30 years.
And what kind of programs does the Seaport offer in terms of this kind of music?
They use music on the grounds to help to, what in museum jargon is, interpret history. So when you go on board the Charles W. Morgan and there's a sail handling demonstration, and the group of staff members, the demonstration squad, they call them, is hauling on a line with 1,500 pounds at the other end. My job would be to coordinate that group in the way it was done during the 19th and early 20th century by singing a halyard shanty that will get everybody pulling at exactly the same time, so that instead of dragging that yard up the mast, which it's a lot of weight,
Right.
you make it jump each time.
Okay.
Right, you want the force to be focused.
Right.
So you get round the corner we will go, round the corner Sally, around Cape Horn through the frost and snow, round the corner Sally. Oh, when we roll around Cape Horn, round the corner Sally, you'll wish to God you'd never been born, round the corner Sally.
Very good. Yes.
So things like that.
Right.
And for any job on board ship, you'd have a body of songs that would fit the motions you're making, fit the rhythm and the motion, with a chorus that the crew could come in on, and it makes the work much less burdensome.
Right.
Even while it doesn't take your mind off the work, it
Right.
focuses you on the work, but you're infusing art into it, so it makes it feel less difficult.
You know what it reminds me of? The stuff I've seen of slaves picking cotton in the South.
And that's actually one of the main sources of shanties. People think of it as an Irish tradition or an Anglo-Irish tradition because during the folk revival, the people who started singing shanties as part of their sets were the Clancy Brothers and other Irish groups. But the 19th century origins of shanties are, if you look at the early sources, it's always talked about as a black tradition. And in fact, the word shanty doesn't appear in print until 1852. And the first use of it in print is describing people stowing cotton on board ships and calls the singing they're doing a shanty.
Right, right. Yes, yeah, I can
And
see that.
the derivation of it is most likely because the big cotton ports were run by the French or French-speaking people in the 1820s and 30s. That's Mobile, Alabama, and New Orleans that are part of the Louisiana Purchase, right?
Right.
So the French stevedores, French-speaking stevedores with these gangs of African-American slaves, when they wanted them to use call and response work songs, they'd yell, "Chantez," which means sing in French. And the sailors would see that. And this is a period where, with all the warfare that dates back to the time of Columbus up to the end of the War of 1812 and the Napoleonic Wars, all that's over. So commercial shipping just expands rapidly. And what happens to sailors on board ships is they find themselves working on larger, heavier rigged vessels with smaller crews, because you don't need a big crew to defend the ship anymore. So they're looking around for ways to get the maximum benefit out of the effort they put into these hard jobs.
Right.
And they said, see that shanty thing? We should do that. So it by the 1830s, it's become almost universal.
That's
at sea.
wonderful. Yes, and I suppose as the ships got bigger, they also went out to sea longer. So people were away for longer periods of time.
Longer runs became standard, although at the same time the technology of sail is improving, so that you get, as their understanding of the effect of hull shape on the speed of ships, you get the clipper ships, and ships were going from New York or Boston to San Francisco in under 100 days.
And of course,
All the way around South America.
Right, there's no Panama Canal to go through.
Right,
yes.
but those ships, were very fast. So actually, it wasn't so much that they were gone for a long time. It's really just that heavier work. And once steam engines got more efficient, it became pretty clear that the age of commercial sail was going to go out, and people started collecting the songs as they started to think, oh, well, this isn't going to be around forever.
Right, interesting. So you have other instruments
I
here.
do.
So why don't you show us, or which one would you like to take first?
Oh, let's see. I'll save the accordion for later. I'll do the most familiar first.
Right, this is the all-encompassing guitar used everywhere.
Used everywhere, and I'll give you a piece that comes from a singer named Kid Bailey, who was recorded back in the late 1920s. He was one of the inspirations for the acoustic blues singer everybody's heard of, Robert Johnson.
Oh, yes.
Right, the big inspiration for people like Eric Clapton. But is a slightly, or half a generation older than Robert Johnson. And this is a piece that he recorded called The Rowdy Blues. Let's see. Oh, I'm in a different tuning. Hold on.
This is one of the things that's interesting about a string instrument. It always has to be tuned.
Well, I'm using different tunings. I changed tunings before I started the fiddle, and I've now changed it on the guitar. I had it tuned to an open D chord.
Takes a good ear to be able to tune.
Ain't gonna marry, I ain't gonna settle down. I'm gonna stay right here till they tear this old barrelhouse down. Well, I love you, baby, tell the world I do. Well, I love you, baby, tell the world I do. I don't love no one in this whole round world but you. There ain't no use Did you read that letter I mailed in your backyard? And it said, so sad, but your best old friends part. Oh, I ain't gonna marry, I ain't gonna settle down. No, I ain't going to marry, I ain't gonna settle down. I'm gonna stay right here till they tear this old barrel house down.
Now, I think of this kind of music as kind of that Delta sound.
That's Delta blues.
Okay, out of mostly black experience in America, and did white people then adapt this kind of music? Because Johnson is a black man too, as I recall, right?
Right, and Kid Bailey was black.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that white people hear this in the big cities, in Chicago, in New York, and then
Well,
they
and
adapt it?
in the country too. This is a piece from a West Virginia musician named Frank Hutchison, and people sometimes call this mountain blues. But once records started getting released back in the early 1920s,
Right.
people could hear music from different backgrounds, and in addition to just earlier white musicians in West Virginia, for instance, would go to railroad work sites where there were African Americans playing music,
okay.
or work alongside them in coal mines and mining towns, things like that. So that exchange goes back, long before that. But once the style called blues develops in the 1890s and first decade of the 1900s, doesn't even get called blues until W.C. Handy sort of names it that right around then. But once that style develops, white musicians became fascinated with it, which is really the story of American popular music from the start. The first music that people thought of as distinctively American, that didn't sound like just European parlor songs, was the music of composers like Stephen Foster and Dan Emmett, who were trying to write in an African American idiom.
Right.
And you go from that to kind of the medicine show music, to early ragtime, to what they call Dixieland jazz or classic jazz. And at each of those stages, African American musicians come up with a new approach to music. White musicians are fascinated by it, copy it. It becomes a popular music.
Right.
But one of the characteristics of African American music is that it keeps changing. People come up with new things, and that's true in West African cultures as well. I studied West African drumming when I was at Wesleyan, and the teacher Abraham Adzenya talked about the music he was from the Akan people in Ghana. And he would go back and visit periodically. And when he'd come back, there was a style of music called gahun, which is what they'd play at the markets. And every few years, he'd come back and say, okay, this is the new gahun. This is what people are playing for gahun now. And it's same group of instruments, but they've changed the rhythm. They've changed the drum calls.
Because they probably heard different music.
Or it's just that kind of change and adaptation and improvisational quality is part of that musical aesthetic.
Okay.
So this is called Worried Blues.
I feel better.
Got the worried blues, got no heart to cry. Got the worried blues, got no heart to cry. Blues don't kill me, boys, I'll never die. Went to the river, on my rocking chair. Went to the river, took along my rocking chair. Blues don't leave me, I'm gonna rock right out of here. I dreamed last night laying back in my bed. I dreamed last night laying back in my bed. I dreamed last night woman I love is dead. Went to the graveyard, looked at my true love's face. Went to the graveyard, looked at my true love's face. Love you, honey, sure won't take your place. Woke up this morning, freight train on my mind. Woke up this morning, freight train on my mind. I believe all around it, my love's gone down the line.
That's very good, very good. I remember a comment Tina Turner once made. Now, Tina Turner used to play with Ike, her husband Ike, and they did this bluesy stuff. And then she left him and started her own career. And she was quoted as saying she adopted and became involved with rock and roll because she found the blues, maybe associated with Ike, way too depressing.
Yeah.
She wanted something much more upbeat, and of course we are indebted to African American music for the whole thing of rock and roll. I mean, Elvis was singing Big Mama Thornton music, but he made it internationally famous.
And I'll give you, so here's a sample of what was happening 100 years before Elvis. This instrument, the banjo, originates in Africa.
Oh, okay.
And the earliest construction was made out of gourds. So you'd hard shell gourd, you'd cut a slice out of it, put a skin head on it, put a neck on it. The closest African instrument that's currently played is called the akonting. But using the same style I used, where you're hitting down with the back of this fingernail. So you're hitting down across the string. And then your thumb catches on the fifth string, or you sometimes drop it down to others. But as it drives down on there, it kind of hangs, and then when your hand comes up, you see that?
Yes.
So I'm not plucking.
Right.
I'm not going across it, I'm coming up.
Right.
So you pick, you strum, and then your thumb sounds.
Oh.
Gonna build me a cabin on a mountain so high where I can see Willie as he rides by. Well, I played cards in England, I gambled in Spain, and I'll bet you $5 I'll beat you next game. Jack Diamond, Jack Diamond, I know I'm old. You have robbed my poor pockets of silver and gold. Oh, sometimes I sit and wonder what makes women love men. Then I look back and I wonder what makes men love them. They ain't nothing but an ocean that flies in the wind. Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, and she never hollers cuckoo till the 4th day of July.
Now, I think think of the banjo as being a white instrument. Now, it's interesting that you tell me, because I always think it is a kind of white mountain stuff out of the West Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky.
Well, you know, that first round of white musicians copying black music was the minstrel show.
Okay.
And while African Americans continued to play banjo up into the 1920s and 30s in their own communities, and play music that in many ways was very similar to what white musicians were playing with banjo and fiddle, that bad taste from the kind of horrible racial stereotypes that the minstrel show indulged in caused there to be just a complete break, really, between African Americans and the banjo for a long time.
Interesting.
Fairly recently, within the last 10 years, there was a conference on African Americans and the banjo down in Tennessee that has been held annually, I think, ever since. And at the very first one, the group that's called the Carolina Chocolate Drops got together, and young African American musicians who were curious about this music. And that group has since won a Grammy.
Oh, okay.
Spun off one of the original members, Dom Flemons, is doing all kinds of really interesting things. But the group is still together, and they're doing really interesting music, and they kind of bring together all sorts of threads of this kind of earlier African American tradition that's great music, but because of that ugly side had been sort of just pushed away.
Right.
And so these young people say, well, wait a minute, there's some great music in here, and it's you know, not the sort of white version of it, but what they're doing is excavating the actual African American music the way that African Americans played it in the 19th century, early 20th century, and they were mentored, for instance, by a North Carolina fiddle and banjo playing pair of brothers named Joe and Odell Thompson, who were when they started working with them in their 80s, I think.
Oh.
And so they'd been born around 1900, 1910,
Sure.
and learned from their parents, and been in communities where that music, just the fiddle and banjo approach, was still, alive.
Right.
And so that was one pathway into that approach to the style.
Wow, that's it. They're kind of interesting little tidbits of history that you give us. But it's you all you do is you kind of hear what's available, and so you don't want to be shut out. So having your discussion about all this kind of stuff and the influences is really very important. I don't think there's anybody who wouldn't say, if it wasn't for African American music, there would be no popular music today.
Right. It would sound really different.
Yes.
And probably be kind of boring.
Definitely.
So the area of the United States that probably more than anywhere else brings together all kinds of people of all kinds of cultures and backgrounds is Louisiana, which makes sense because it's the mouth of the Mississippi River.
Right.
And
it's French. It's been Spanish.
it's French, it's Spanish, African, Caribbean,
slaves, the Caribbean,
right?
Absolutely.
And so much moves up and down that river to this day. 90% of America's cargo moves by water. You see all those big trucks on the highway? Most of that has been on water. And the Mississippi River takes out a huge $41 billion worth of produce of various kinds, comes out down the Mississippi River every year. And when you think about American popular music, rivers are at the heart of it.
Right.
What are the big music towns, right? New Orleans, Kansas City, St. Louis, Nashville, right? Chicago on the Great Lakes.
Right. Right.
And of course New York and Philadelphia have their own.
Right.
But ports. That's because different groups of people are moving through,
Sure.
hearing different things, and that's what makes American music so exciting and interesting.
Right. Right.
So this is an instrument that came to the United States from Germany.
Oh.
It's the single row button accordion. This form of accordion is the earliest type of bellows driven free reed instrument to be kind of a modern instrument. And the makers in Louisiana took them and sort of supercharged them. So they're
So this is kind
pinned
of
the microphone.
so this is kind of that Zydeco.
Zydeco, or I'm
Right.
gonna play a song called "Chérie si cher là-bas," which means "My love goes here, my love goes there."
French Canadian.
And it's a Cajun and Creole song from Louisiana. So you won't understand a word I say.
That's all right.
Even French people don't understand this. Chérie, si elle t'aime pas, mais oui que moi je t'aime. Moi je t'aime, chérie, si, mais oui, mon chérie, chérie, si elle t'aime pas, tu fais tout ce que t'aimes. Moi je connais ce bébé, mais oui, à part Chérie, si elle va, mais oui que mon va. Mon va, et chérie, si, mais oui, mon
Now that accordion is which are buttons versus the accordion that I played, which was a keyboard. So this is an older kind of.
Yeah, and it's diatonic. It's like a harmonica in a box, right?
Oh,
That's just one button. So push, pull, push, pull, pull, push, pull, pull, push. Very much like
Okay.
playing a harmonica, except that you can't bend notes.
and so this comes out of Louisiana. What other kind of traditions come out of Louisiana in terms of this kind of roots music?
Oh, well, the Zydeco is a little different. That's what the black French-speaking neighbors of the Cajuns modified Cajun music into. So you get this. Dance all night, dance a little longer. Stay all night, stay a little longer. Dance all night, dance a little longer. Can't see why you can't stay a little longer. Things like that.
Wonderful.
That's a piece that sounds pretty close to Cajun music, but a lot of it is it'll be a 5-piece band with accordion, the rub board, the
Right.
frottoir, and then electric bass, electric guitar, and drums.
Okay.
So a lot more kind of R&B and blues and Caribbean influences, things like that.
Well, we're about to wrap up this show, so I want people, if you want to you have some recordings out there?
I do.
You do? And how would people just find out about your recordings and your music?
They can send me an email on that.
Okay,
That,
so that's
at
Fiddler
that
Craig
address.
over here at
Yeah.
gmail.com. And what kind of recordings do you have that are available?
My most recent one is a recording with a band that I play with that does old-time music for dancing.
Oh, okay.
And it's got a lot of fiddle harmonies and neat repertoire. The band is called the Dead Sea Squirrels.
The Dead Sea Squirrels.
Yes.
Okay, that's a cute one. All
Right.
right. And when you're actually playing in different locations around.
The most regular thing I have is every Monday night at John's Mystic River Tavern on Cottrell Street in Mystic. There's an open session of old time music for people who play fiddle, banjo, guitar, mandolin, bass, and we usually have anywhere from 3 to a dozen musicians come down and knock out tunes from about 9 till about closing on Monday nights.
That's great. And you also give lessons for people
I give
who
lessons, yes.
Right, who want to learn.
I teach up at Wesleyan University, and I play with several different bands. The Dead Sea Squirrels. I have a band called the Root Farmers that does a range of different music that I play. I'm playing with a great musician who writes songs over in Rhode Island. His own kind of original music, John Speziale. And a Zydeco band called the Zydecats, which has been around for a long time. We don't play out that frequently anymore, but at least a few times a year we'll kick out the jams.
Well, that is wonderful, and I am so happy to have you come on my show and literally just really entertain us with a whole bunch of this kind, and give us a really interesting history lesson about the stuff that we are too familiar with, and then forget, where it really came from.
Right.
And I also, as a reminder to us about the tremendous accomplishments and gratitude we have to some of those African American traditions that came here, people who came here not voluntarily, and in fact gave us, they adapted their African music to this country, to the music they heard from, from the UK, and also from, I guess we don't hear enough of it, of Native Americans as well, who have their own musical traditions. And except for maybe once a year when there's a big powwow, we completely forget about their traditions, and the fact that particularly in New England there was a mixing of African Americans and American native tribes.
Well, in other places too, Florida, Louisiana. Cajun French has French, English, and Choctaw.
Right. So yes, so it's completely lost to us.
Yeah.
So again, I want to thank Craig, and if you want anything about his music, his recordings, his venue dates, and if you want some lessons, it's at fiddlercraig@gmail.com. So Craig, I'm glad to have you here, and hopefully you'll come back and maybe bring some more musicians with you.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. So this is Harriet Grayson, and I want to, hopefully my audience has been highly entertained by Craig. And we're always looking for new guests, so if you have a favorite musician, theater group, artist who you would like to have featured, by all means contact me at harrietgrayson@gmail.com, because we're always looking for interesting and new acts to put on. I'm going to go into the booking business after this. So I hope you've enjoyed today's show. And this is Harriet Grayson. It's been my pleasure. And this is Community Culture Showcase.